The Erunasis Medallion by Andulairah.
Should you see the light of your future within the shadows of your present, the resilience of life dancing over vast deserts of death, witness, if you so shall dare, the majesty of creation, woven with the threads of God. The connectedness of all was and always will be. Entanglement? No, we call it love. Fade on.
Thebes, 1882.
Do bring that bloody lantern here now, Webber!
Professor Clarence shouted through the dark of the night.
A snail could move its backside faster than you!
Standing on a pile of shale with his hands impatiently slapped across his hips, Professor Clarence sharply sighed through the waning light of a flickering oil lantern. His armpits were soaked with sweat, and his breathing was labored and wheezy, a testament to the long hours of back-breaking toil he had endured amidst the pillowing clouds of endless dust coating everything and everyone in sight. Looking above the rim of his grubby glasses, he squinted curiously at the quarry wall towering before him. It was an odd wall, rich with shale and well over 12 feet, and his attention was particularly drawn toward an unusual timber plank sticking out from it, which was found earlier that evening. He grunted and groveled to himself, deep in careful thought, until he raised his pipe to his mouth and inhaled deeply.
So, what are you thinking, boss?
Bradford eagerly asked over the professor's shoulder.
Indeed, I'm thinking you've made a splendid discovery this evening, Bradford.
The professor quietly replied, lost within the pillars of white smoke leaving his mouth. Members of the expedition anxiously huddled around Professor Clarence, feeling an eternity pass them by, eagerly waiting for him to draw a conclusion. A sharp, sudden gust of wind blew shale from the edge of the wall, straight into the professor's sweating face. He coughed and spat loudly, quickly wiping his chapped lips with his silk handkerchief through the remaining light of his lantern, which was swiftly dying, just as his patience was also.
Now, Webber!
He shouted angrily above his head, cracking the still Egyptian night air.
Yes, Professor.
Echoed Webber's voice in the distance, muffled by the clanking of various tools.
Sorry, I couldn't find the kerosene.
At last, Webber clumsily stumbled out from the darkness and rushed back down toward the quarry, 2 swinging lanterns in hand. A nerdy yet bright geologist fresh from Oxford, Webber was one of 30-something members that made up the Akhenaten project, a covert expedition led and commissioned by Professor Clarence O'Mittenthorpe and based at the Theban necropolis. And the professor's objective was blatantly simple: to uncover the tomb of the ancient pharaoh king, Akhenaten. Webber pushed his crooked glasses back onto his face and anxiously squeezed his way through the crowd of exhausted faces, finally reaching the impatient professor.
I do indeed apologize.
He panted with a sheepish grin.
I just couldn't find...
Disgruntled, Professor Clarence glared at Webber and snatched the lantern from his hand, swinging it in front of the quarry wall, becoming engrossed once more. His curiosity was deftly getting the better of him, and he felt as though he was onto something, whatever that something was. He gently rubbed his fingers against the old plank of the wood, and much to his own surprise, the splinters were so soft that they fell to the ground like feathers. Professor Clarence took a step back and wiped his forehead with his sleeve.
I believe this is the entrance of the shaft, coming down from that old workman's hut we found on Monday,
he announced, frowning hard at the brow.
A bold statement, Professor,
quizzed Brooks, appearing totally unconvinced, his chubby arms crossed over his chest.
Considering the lack of luck we've had thus far. Well, I don't mind being the optimistic archaeologist on this project, whilst you, Brooks, may remain the pessimistic one, if it so shall very well pleases you.
The professor stiffly muttered. Raising an unconvinced eyebrow, Brooks pursed his lips together, running his dirty fingers over his balding head. Excited murmurs quietly erupted within the group. The team had uncovered the remains of an ancient workman's hut several days prior, with the lofty hopes that a tomb may be nearby. And truthfully speaking, it was the only hope they had left to hold on to. Professor Clarence, meanwhile, was feeling much more than just hope, and despite his aloof disposition, his stomach danced with excitement. He knew there was something beyond the old plank. He could feel it. His decision was made. He thrust his right hand immediately over his shoulder.
Righto, pass me a hammer,
he ordered abruptly. Bradford quickly fumbled within a tool pouch and passed Professor Clarence a rock hammer. Very, very delicately, he began tapping into the shale surrounding the old plank. The shale was falling fast at his feet.
Good gracious,
he gasped in awe.
It's falling so far.
Professor Clarence's words were acutely cut short when the timber plank, along with several monstrous blocks of sandstone, fell from the quarry wall and plummeted through the earth into a dangerously large, gaping hole. In a desperate attempt to save himself, the professor stumbled backward and tripped over Moss with all his maps, and like a domino effect, poor old Moss fell onto everybody else, stirring up a frenzy of shrieks and screams that rang out over the King's Valley, loud enough to wake up the Egyptian dead.
Professor!
Moss spluttered through the thick cloud of white dust engulfing the night air, swiftly putting everyone into a coughing frenzy.
Are you all right, Professor? I bloody well landed on you, Moss.
Professor Clarence coughed, picking up his glasses from the dirt.
Albeit, do I dare admit that I'm a trifle more worried that I've gone and squashed all our beloved survey maps. Not a bother, Professor.
Moss assured politely, pulling the creases out of his sack of rolled maps.
They're swell.
As everyone gathered their wits, the team quickly stood to their feet once more, nervously waiting for the dust to settle down. And when it finally did, hushed whispers and sharp gasps said it all. A magnificent black hole was revealed, exposing an old and brittle limestone stairway leading into an eerie dark shaft. Naturally, the entire team was utterly flabbergasted, struggling to put their disbelief into words, especially the professor. He glanced down into the dark hole, his heart throbbing against his chest, plaguing him with tantalizing visions of what may await him beyond the looming darkness.
Dear Lord, I just cannot believe our good fortune,
he muttered quietly.
Is it really happening, Professor?
Wondered Weber, squinting down into the large hole.
I mean, do you really
think this could be an entrance to a tomb.
Professor Clarence knelt down on his knees, admiring the delicious thought.
Well, there's only one way to find out.
He looked up at Weber's flummoxed face.
And indeed, I am the one to do it.
Not wasting a second more, Professor Clarence crouched down into the hole with his lantern and sat on the ancient limestone.
Hang on a minute. Are you going to go down there now, boss?
Bradford wandered over, pulling his braces back over his robust shoulders.
Well, yes, Bradford, I jolly well am. May I inquire if anyone has notified Dr. Harby?
Apparently some of his servant lads have gone to wake him.
Very well. Would you fetch Huxley and ask him to pour me an Earl Grey?
2 sugars?
Bradford asked, turning on his heel. The professor nodded.
2 sugars.
As Bradford went to search for Huxley, it was at this moment that Professor Clarence noticed something rather odd. He glimpsed deeper into the dark shaft and found that it had been obscured by a cluster of huge granite boulders.
Strange. Used to deter zealous loiters, I suspect.
He thought to himself. Opening the pocket of his dusty double-breasted vest, he pulled out a worn, folded map of documented tombs that had been discovered by explorers before him. Holding it toward the amber flames, licking the inside walls of his lantern, he scanned it carefully.
KV-13, KV-17, WV. What the hell was Napoleon doing when he plotted these points?
He scorned, twisting the map around and around in his fingers.
Having a drink?
Some cheeky voice called out. Everyone laughed.
Bloody well seems so.
Professor Clarence grumbled.
Because clearly, this site isn't even marked.
Even though none of them had a clue of what to expect, this new, surreptitious discovery had thankfully changed the dynamic of the expedition for the better, injecting a much-needed boost of morale within the exhausted Akhenaten team, for it had begun to wane over the last several days. The merciless working conditions, coupled with the dry, barren landscape upon the edge of the Sahara Desert, evidently made it easy for anyone to buckle and snap, particularly the aging professor. It was simply much too hot to undertake work throughout the long, sweltering day, and thus the team slept or swam on the banks of the Nile. They made up for it at night, however, for they worked long, arduous hours deep into the night, every night. The only people that didn't seem to suffer were the Egyptian folk providing hospitality and domestic duties for the camp.
I think the time is upon us to explore this shaft,
Professor Clarence announced, rising to his feet and patting his dusty hands on his trousers. Team members exchanged looks of concern.
But boss,
replied Bradford, stunned, taking the pencil out from behind his ear.
we haven't even secured the entrance yet, boss.
Never mind that, Bradford.
The professor shook his head quickly, taking his cup of tea from Huxley.
Time is ticking. Assemble the beams as I'm exploring.
He wandered down the remainder of the stairway, sipping his brew, until he turned over his shoulder.
The temptation to restrain myself any longer is much too overbearing.
And thus, with that being said, the professor cautiously walked into the looming darkness of the hall, much to everyone else's dismay, with the lantern being his only accompaniment.
Oh, you're going alone?
Moss called out as everybody scrambled around the hall entrance.
Well, who's brave enough to come? Hey.
Professor Clarence turned over his shoulder, his voice bouncing off the walls of sandstone.
Well, of course I will come,
muttered Dr. Harby, quickly squeezing his way past the worried faces. His Egyptian chaperones quickly flocked to his side.
Lala,
The doctor shook his head at them, raising a defiant hand.
لحظة شوية.
The modest, hard-working men obeyed quickly and withdrew back into the crowd.
Didn't think you would rise to the occasion, Harvey.
Professor Clarence snickered.
Ah, my English friend, you must have more faith in me.
Dr. Harvey crawled down into the hole.
I had a bad case of stomach upset. I believe it would be the mutton rice we ate last night.
I admit I'm glad you can join me now.
And I'm sure not missing out either.
Added Brooks without hesitation, squatting down onto the stairs. They both eagerly caught up with the professor, whom had already hoisted his lanky legs over those mammoth blocks.
Easy, Professor.
Brooks cringed, watching the brittle professor.
You're not as young as you look.
You just worry about yourself, young Brooks.
Chuckled Professor Clarence, running his hands along the dusty walls.
There is still some oil left in these old bones. You and Harvey just mind your step, and do not try to kick up a jolly mess.
It didn't take long for their lanterns to reveal a large rectangular passageway ahead of them, extending as far as the eye could see.
Now, well, isn't this just splendid?
Gushed the professor, glancing at the finely chiseled walls.
I feel in my heart that we are onto something.
Dr. Harvey agreed.
And yet, I still cannot believe this site is not on the map.
The professor laughed, turning over his shoulder back toward the entrance.
It's absurd.
Well, perhaps they didn't want it on the map.
Brooks answered smugly.
Now, Brooks, let us not get too carried away.
Scoffed the professor, squashing the ominous idea as quickly as it was said. Dr. Harvey, meanwhile, shared a quick glance with Brooks, hoping he wasn't right. The dream of uncovering the 18th dynastic pharaoh king, Akhenaten, was quickly unraveling itself into a tangible reality. Professor Clarence and his team had been digging for several weeks without a slither of luck, until the professor coincidentally met the Egyptologist, Dr. Mamdouh Harbi, at a plush banquet in downtown Cairo. Dr. Harbi, in turn, seemed to know an awful lot about the ancient lands, suggesting Professor Clarence take his team to an unspoiled, shale-rich area along the Nile River's west bank. It would be difficult to get there, Dr. Harbi advised, yet good results were highly likely. Naturally, a hefty fee was in order for Dr. Harbi's invaluable expertise, which of course Professor Clarence was more than obliged to pay. Yet, unfortunately, as fate would have it, the next 2 weeks proved unfavorable under Dr. Harbi's instruction, for the only discovery the team uncovered was one dead-end shaft, at best. Professor Clarence was almost certainly convinced that he had wasted his sterling on Dr. Harbi, but now, with this latest discovery, the professor was hoping he would finally get his money's worth. Listening to the sounds of their boots crunching under the old dirt, their lanterns absorbed the grand immensity of the dark and eerie passageway hovering beyond them.
Forgive me, but I cannot shake the feeling that we're crashing someone's party,
muttered Brooks sarcastically, peering into the darkness.
Well, Brooks, you can always turn back,
suggested Professor Clarence coyly.
Professor, are you hinting that I'm scared?
I don't believe I'm hinting anything.
Boomed Weber's voice, dancing all over the walls from behind them.
Someone tell that kid to put a bloody sock in it,
gabbled Brooks irritably.
Again, tell me what he does besides being a pain in my backside.
All is dandy, Weber.
Hollered Professor Clarence.
Relax.
Oh, now will you look at that?
Gasped Dr. Harbi excitedly, thrusting his lantern out in front of him.
The passageway separates down into a twin stairway. Oh, And look, a limestone ramp in between. This is the classic beginnings of a tomb chamber.
A magical feeling melted through Professor Clarence's entire body.
Marvelous,
he whispered, barely able to contain the adrenaline bursting through his veins. He turned over his shoulder toward the hole entrance.
We found something!
He cried out.
If you haven't heard from us in a half hour, then do come looking. As you wish, Professor.
Weber called, poking his head through the dark hole.
We'll be waiting.
Anxiously stepping down the ancient stairway, the three of them knew they were indeed wandering into the realm of something unworldly. The air became cool and musty, and sounds from the others had all but diminished. As they carefully reached the bottom, they walked into a magnificently large, rectangular cavern. And if that wasn't enough, just a few yards in front of them, the passageway abruptly separated into three. Passageways that stood dark, silent, and seriously uninviting.
Well now, would you look at that?
Mumbled an amused Professor Clarence.
I don't care to frighten you, gentlemen,
Dr. Harby quietly said, in his thick Egyptian accent.
but I feel these walls have eyes. I don't like it.
Oh, now, was saying that entirely necessary?
Brooks muttered, rolling his eyes.
Well, you said something similar yourself,
retorted Dr. Harby, peering at Brooks's round face.
Yes, but I was half joking.
Well, of course I'm not afraid of the dead,
retorted Dr. Harby.
but I just feel as if we are not meant to be entering. Do you not feel it yourselves?
I think you've read too many spook stories, Harby.
Chuckled Professor Clarence.
You are welcome to turn back.
Despite his reluctance, Dr. Harby shook it off.
I'm not going back.
So then, are we feeling bold, gentlemen?
The professor asked the two of them, adjusting his waistcoat.
I think it's time we split up and see just how big our balls are.
Actually, what we are seeing here is typical of the ancient Egyptian culture,
added Dr. Harby, glancing into the looming passageways of blackness.
We Egyptians are the original labyrinthes.
Well, my cherry sack is the biggest out of the lot of you, and I don't mind a few old ghosts.
Snickered Brooks with a smug grin.
I'll take the passage on the left,
volunteered Dr. Harby.
And I'll tackle the right,
replied the professor.
And Brooks, how about you and your big cherries handle the middle?
Riddled with a mixture of excitement and rattling nerves, each of them quietly walked toward their designated passageways.
Hold on to your britches,
muttered the professor, watching as the other two disappeared with their dancing lanterns.
And please, refrain from waking anyone up.
Moving through the stagnant passageway, Professor Clarence didn't want to admit it, but he too felt as if he was being watched, as did Dr. Harby.
Don't be bloody ridiculous, Clarence,
he scolded himself, erasing the thought immediately. Not long after, his lingering thoughts became quickly distracted by the nauseating smells of dead rodents.
Good God,
he gasped, thrusting a handkerchief to his mouth. After a good long while walking, dodging cobwebs and piles of dirt, the professor stumbled upon a smooth limestone ramp, which more resembled an ancient slippery dip. Alas, not at all the fun, comforting type, judging by the sheer steepness of what he was able to glimpse, and yet still, the delicious dream of finding the looted tomb of Akhenaten overpowered his concern, almost too much to bear, crippling his old bones. He was so close to achieving the seemingly impossible, that he would risk his life under every circumstance in doing so. Gently, the professor felt his body begin to slide, slowly at first, which was more than fine with him. But then he started gaining traction and slid faster and faster. And try as he might, the faster he went, the more he knew he was losing control. His body slipped and skidded, recklessly cavorting down into the never-ending darkness. He frantically searched the walls for something to grab, his fingers digging into the smooth rock, but there was nothing. Everything became a dark, messy blur, and even worse, he slid straight past a large opening on his right. Thrusting the soles of his boots into the limestone. Echoed the voice of Brooks in the distance. After almost wearing the entire contents of his stomach all over his clothes, Professor Clarence suddenly rolled onto a flat surface in a sorry heap, with his wildly swinging kerosene lantern smacking against his body.
Jesus! Jesus Christ! Jesus!
He deliriously panted, curling up in a fetal position as he coughed through a cloud of dust. He was relieved he'd managed to survive it. Momentarily, after gathering his wits, he dizzily sat up and shone the lantern back up toward the top of the ramp, exposing the deathly sharp incline.
Bloody hell!
He hissed, exasperated, feeling the aftermath of adrenaline shooting through his nervous system.
Professor!
Dr. Harpy's voice echoed through the stagnant air in the far distance.
What do you see, Professor? Are you there?
Disorientated, Professor Clarence stood to his feet, only to be swiftly greeted with a ghastly sight. Laying just a yard away was a bone-chilling, endless dark pit. His stomach dropped through his knees, squinting through the lantern light at its ominous invitation. Had he rolled just a fraction more, and Professor Clarence would have no doubt plummeted to his untimely death. Sighing with relief, he peered beyond the other side of the pit and noticed another passageway.
Jimmy Crickets!
He snickered with delight.
This just keeps getting better and better.
How he would cross the pit? He had no idea, but turning back was absolutely not an option. He must push on. Delicately balancing on his tippy toes, Professor Clarence managed to cautiously sidestep along the edge of the dusty pit. Carefully and methodically, one step after the other, and just shy of reaching the other side, he hurled himself across the portentous gaping hole, slamming his frail body hard against the cold limestone with a great big thud.
God blimey!
He muttered, wiping his face with his dirty handkerchief.
I'm too old for this bloody nonsense.
Very unexpectedly, a different type of aroma began to linger within the stale air, twitching precariously at the professor's nostrils. Rising to his feet, he trod on down through the passageway, and the more he walked, the stronger the aroma became. It was an odd, peculiar smell, and surprisingly, quite a pleasant one. It invoked a flurry of butterflies within him, stirring his anxious thoughts. He eagerly quickened his pace, allowing his nose to guide the way through the darkness, and before he knew it, the passageway opened up, and his heart skipped a beat, quite literally. he whispered, the oxygen rudely snatched away from his lungs. He stood frozen in awe for several seconds, but to him it felt like a lifetime. Thrusting his lantern above his head, Professor Clarence suddenly realized that he had fortuitously stumbled into a most exquisite chamber of ancient majesty, merely fit for the spoken word. Everywhere he looked, his eyes were met with a wealth beyond compare. The chamber, overflowing with an uninhibited opulence, was spilling over with precious metal ornaments, priceless jewels, silken tapestries woven with a gold more yellow than the sun itself, mysterious carvings embedded into hundreds of thin copper scrolls, and a myriad of clay cartouches that were neatly tucked away inside huge bronze urns. And this was in one glimpse. It was indeed a most grand sight to behold. Professor Clarence swallowed hard, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. His life would never be the same. He glanced around, his neck stretched tall, admiring the chamber's colossal walls, riddled with 1,000 tales of an ancient lifetime. Tales that revealed an illustrious history of richness, of glory, of supreme reign that influenced the movements of a grand human civilization over an epoch. And as his heart melted down the sleeve of his shirt, the professor knew without a shadow of doubt that he had discovered the entrance of a sarcophagus chamber, and not just any old sarcophagus, but that of a royal one. He carefully walked toward the eastern end of the chamber, noticing on his left a painted mural of an eloquent couple nursing several children. They appeared to be worshipping the sun disk Aten, with the deities Isis and Nephthys watching over ever protectively.
How can it be so?
He gasped, cut with emotion, instantly recognizing this scenario. He slowly dragged his calloused fingers through the thin layer of dust along the mural's smooth surface. Judging by the wall mural alone, he quickly concluded the sarcophagus must have belonged to an extremely high-ranking royal, and hopefully within the 18th dynasty, the golden age of Egypt. And just when he thought his besieged eyes could take no more of the prolific beauty engulfing them, his gaze fell over a most dazzling sight. He glimpsed a stunning, ruby quartzite sarcophagus sitting silently within the center of the chamber upon a slab of alabaster.
Oh my.
Professor Clarence muttered, clutching his chest, almost feeling compelled to kneel. The sarcophagus was covered in a plethora of ornate carvings, glyphs, and reliefs, the work of someone blessed with the most delicate of hands and the sharpest of eyes. It instantaneously commanded the deepest reverence, yet at the same time, like a cool shadow cast over a midday sun, a solemn feeling seeped through the professor's veins, and he began to feel weird. A feeling as if he was trespassing, and it was unshakable. Dr. Harvey's words flooded his mind.
I just feel as if we are not meant to be entering. Do you not feel it?
Professor Clarence shuddered and forced the harrowing thoughts far from his mind. As the light from his lantern soaked in the beauty of the sarcophagus, to his own absolute horror, he noticed that the lid had been removed.
Removed? What in God's name is going on here?
He stammered, bewildered, quickly noticing the lid leaning against the western wall beside the many canopic jars shoved along the altar. Alarm bells deafened his head. Professor Clarence was mortified. He knew it was almost impossible that tomb robbers could have found this chamber. It had been buried for who knows how many thousands of years.
Maybe there was an emergency thousands of years ago, and they didn't finish the proper burial.
The professor thought to himself.
No, come on, Clarence. What could be more important than burying a pharaoh?
He suddenly got the shock of his life when he heard the fear-stricken screams of Brooks and Dr. Harby slice through the stale air, and he smirked to himself. Several moments later, an enormous scuffle was heard, followed by the shouting of many colorful expletives in both Arabic and English. The professor chuckled, relieved that they were okay, but mostly because they were not too far away, for his own uneasiness was beginning to get the better of him. He quietly peeked into the sarcophagus to investigate, almost buckling at the knees, when he glimpsed a stunning coffin nestled within the sarcophagus.
Professor, can you hear me? Professor!
Cried an anxious Dr. Harby.
Professor! Can you hear me, Professor? I'm here, Harby!
Shouted Professor Clarence.
I'm okay. The pit, Professor!
Dr. Harby's discombobulated voice bounced over the walls.
Allah! How did you get over it? Just don't look down, Doctor.
Professor Clarence responded as he ran his handkerchief over the coffin lid, wiping away the layer of ancient dust.
Do hurry up and get a shuffle on, will you?
Anthropoid in shape, the mysterious coffin was carved from a rare type of cypress wood and hammered with a fine layer of gold leaf. Holding the lantern close to the lid surface, Professor Clarence tried to lift it, but as he did so, he chipped it.
Blasted!
He huffed with frustration, gently putting it back down. Sighing, he stared into its illuminate splendor, embellished with hundreds of ancient symbols and colorful precious gems, all neatly carved in cloisonné style. And if the professor didn't have an inkling of whom may lay resting within these chamber walls, well then, he sure did now, for the face scribed on the lid undoubtedly belonged to that of an exquisitely beautiful woman. Her wide, exotic eyes were fashioned with white calcite, exaggerated with thick blue lapis, extending to the far outer corners of her face. And then there was a red jasper sun disk, Aten, positioned directly above her head, sitting on her coal hair, cloaked with clusters of turquoise faience and rimmed with beads of gold. Utterly enchanted, Professor Clarence traced down to the middle area of the lid, over her crossed arms, and noticed a finely engraved image of the goddess Isis, with her feathered wings upstretched toward an odd-looking gold medallion. And this, subsequently, more than caught his attention. It was a medallion unlike anything he had seen before, with a foreign script wrapping around a center stone in a spiral-like style. A stone that seemed to shimmer in blushy pink and white tones. It was certainly not resembling anything Egyptian, nor anything else he had documented prior, and it left him speechless. Dr. Harby gasped, rudely cutting through Professor Clarence's inquisitive thoughts.
Subhanallah!
Subhanallah, holy God!
Brooks muttered behind him, his neck permanently stretched over the ornately carved ceilings.
Jesus!
Professor Clarence jumped, throwing his lantern in front of his face.
You bloody well frightened me, the pair of you did.
He glared at them. Yet, alas, his words fell on deaf ears, for Dr. Harby and Brooks were vehemently eclipsed within the magnificence that summoned their full attention.
Astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah.
Dr. Harby dropped his face in his hands.
This is too much for any man to bear witness to.
He turned his pained face slowly, sweat dripping down from his brow, and glimpsed Professor Clarence leaning over the sarcophagus.
Oh, you removed the sarcophagus lid on your own?
He questioned with surprise.
No.
Professor Clarence retorted defensively.
It was already off.
Already off?
Dr. Harby muttered, perplexed.
Taken off?
He crept beside the professor, gazing within the sarcophagus, his fingers sliding over the eye area of the coffin.
But how?
Professor Clarence shook his head.
I don't know.
Dr. Harby's eyes grew wide.
Allah,
he whispered, blotting the tears running from his eyes.
Words have escaped me. I am utterly disturbed, and yet equally captivated.
Professor Clarence put a comforting hand on Dr. Harby's shoulder.
Are you okay?
Dr. Harby gazed into Professor Clarence's exhausted face.
Professor,
he began quietly.
You do know whose tomb this is, don't you?
Nothing less than a female of royalty,
the professor replied, watching Dr. Harby wipe his face.
She's more than royal.
Dr. Harby whispered slowly, his dark eyes drawn toward the coffin once more.
This is the mastaba of the great Queen Nefertiti.
So sure, Doctor?
Professor Clarence frowned hard.
Undoubtedly.
Professor Clarence watched Dr. Harby's wandering eyes become fixated on a statue embedded with crystal irises and sapphire pupils beside the altar.
I read the hieroglyphs walking into this chamber.
Dr. Harby's transfixed eyes emptied.
We should leave at once.
Professor Clarence chuckled nervously.
Now, I've just discovered the most remarkable tomb of all time. And do forgive me for saying it, Harby, but you seem somewhat disappointed.
Dr. Harby touched Professor Clarence's wrist and stared into his bloodshot eyes.
Do you not feel the shadow befallen upon us already, Professor?
He murmured gravely.
Mark my word. The warning is written on these very walls. I felt it just before we entered the triple passageway. I should have turned around then. Indeed, I should have.
The warning of what, precisely?
Dr. Harby pursed his lips together.
To keep out, or bear the wrath of Amut.
Do spare me with your fairy tales, Dr. Harby,
scoffed Brooks, glancing into the sarcophagus.
Oh, fairy tales, chap. We don't know why the lid is off. There could be a very simple explanation.
Professor Clarence frowned hard, not taking lightly to Dr. Harby's words.
I am trying with my utmost effort to heed your words, Doctor.
Professor Clarence inhaled deeply.
But I'm finding it rather difficult. Instead, do enlighten us with your skills of translating the coffin, would you please?
Dr. Harby quickly shook his head.
I do not think it is prudent to do so.
Professor Clarence seemed exasperated.
Well, if we're already doomed men,
he grumbled tartly,
then there'd be no harm in it now, would there?
Dr. Harby didn't budge, and the air grew thick between all of them.
And to think you were so eager to join us down here,
Brooks sneered.
Yes, well, I've changed my mind now.
Dr. Harby replied flatly.
Well, at least help us remove the lid,
glared Professor Clarence. With Dr. Harby still reluctant, Professor Clarence and Brooks shrugged their shoulders and went ahead on their own accord, pulling off the coffin lid.
Oh, shit!
Brooks cried desperately.
Oh, my fingers are slipping! Oh, for God's sake!
Professor Clarence shouted, his own arms trembling.
Oh, whatever you do, don't drop it! I'm dropping it!
Brooks cried, fumbling it. Seeing the fragile coffin lid almost smash into the corner of the sarcophagus, Dr. Harby darted forward and grabbed the bottom end of it, saving it just before it slammed into the hard quartzite.
Oh, well now that was close.
Brooks stammered through his heavy panting.
Quickly!
Professor Clarence gritted through his teeth, feeling his sweating fingers slipping.
Put it down on the floor, carefully.
As they finally rested the lid onto the floor, Dr. Harby felt contempt for the other two crawling over his skin like a virus. They peeked into the sarcophagus with their lanterns, observing neatly tucked linen within the coffin, entwined with dried leaves of the olive tree, pollen from a date palm, and mottled flowers of jasmine and papyrus, with everything meticulously sealed around the edges in a thin layer of black resin.
Well, we finally found where that strange odour was coming from. Strange, but nice.
Brooks snickered.
The never-ending smelling perfume. We'd be rich men if we got this stuff bottled.
The black resin is a fatty substance mixed with precious oils that will last forever, should it be kept intact,
Dr. Harby informed.
But break the seal, and the smell is no longer. The ancient Egyptians were of another intelligence, if you shan't have already noticed.
And another kind of wealth.
Brooks smiled zealously, his eyeballs reflecting the amber glint of the lantern.
But you gentlemen must admit that something is clearly not right here.
Dr. Harby pressed on quietly.
The lid was removed from the sarcophagus, and everything is left in pristine order.
He stared at the both of them.
Now truly, if it were the work of tomb robbers, this chamber would be ravaged and desecrated. Think about it.
Yes, 'tis a mystery, Doctor.
Professor Clarence turned to meet his concerned face.
An ominous one, if I may say so.
Dr. Harby mumbled under his breath, turning away.
Are you sure you're not in this for material gain and accolade, Harby?
Sighed Brooks dryly.
I mean, it's quite obvious that you want us to leave this discovery in Egypt with you and your people.
An astute man, Dr. Harby glanced up at Brooks calmly, ignoring his accusatory jabs.
I am wealthy enough, alhamdulillah.
He replied nonchalantly, staring into Brooks's suspicious eyes.
It has gone far beyond accolade and plunder for me now. I am Egyptian. I honor and respect our ancient ones. And quite simply put, we have stepped into something we will never rid ourselves from. A dark shadow now lingers over our souls. A shadow that I cannot shake from my conscience. Naturally, however, you, Brooks, wouldn't understand any of this, because you are an English brute.
Why, you're a bit of a sour bastard, aren't you, Harby?
Snapped Brooks angrily.
I've had it with bloody blubbering towelheads and Egyptian sorcerers and dusty cups of Turkish coffee and bloody camels in their bloody caravans everywhere.
So, what are you waiting for?
Dr. Harby seethed, glaring into Brooks's vexed face.
Go back to your country then. Had it not been for those towheads and camels, you'd be still walking with your crap on the outskirts of Old Cairo.
Easy, Brooks. Easy, Brooks, easy.
Interrupted Professor Clarence, squeezing a firm hand around Brooks's wrist, shooting him a stern look. a look reminding him of all the diplomatic clout Dr. Harby had, and that they very well needed for the exportation of any artifacts out of Egypt. The air had grown uncomfortably tense, to say the least. Brooks and Dr. Harby shared a stiff exchange for several seconds, until several harrowing cries caught them off guard.
Professor!
A voice echoed in the distance.
Sounds like Weber.
Muttered Professor Clarence.
Yes!
He cried out.
We're in here!
They were met with silence.
So, if it is Nefertiti, as you say,
Professor Clarence surmised, returning his attention back to the sarcophagus beside Dr. Harby.
then why would she be buried in the King's Valley? Most likely because of the high limestone content,
Speculated Dr. Harby.
but mostly I would assume for her own protection. Everyone would have been looking for her inside the pyramids.
The sound of scuffling footsteps was heard from outside the chamber's entrance.
Oh, Professor!
Weber's anxious voice bounced from the chamber walls. The light of his lantern lit up his dust-covered face, but it did little to hide his overwhelming emotion.
Oh, my Christ in heaven! Professor, my eyes are watering. I can hardly keep them open. I just can't think straight. Holy shit! Holy God! Look at this place. I can't believe it. And that smell. Take a deep breath, Weber.
Brooks snickered, watching him buckle over at the waist. As Weber drew closer, he quickly noticed Brooks, Dr. Harby, and Professor Clarence leaning over the sarcophagus. His face was aghast.
You three took that sarcophagus lid off?
He hissed incredulously.
It was already off.
Protested Professor Clarence. Weber let out a mortified gasp.
But how?
He screwed his face up.
Thieves? Well, we don't know.
Grunted the professor.
Why don't you come over here?
He said impatiently.
And don't be touching anything now. The young cock was almost going to be sleeping in that death pit tonight.
Jeered Bradford from behind, knocking Weber's shoulders as he walked past him.
Ran myself right up the lip of that pit, he did. It was an accident.
Weber replied smugly, giving Bradford a meek smile.
I couldn't stop rolling down that bloody sliding ramp, and if I didn't ram into Bradford, I would have fallen into it. Almost lost me sodded spectacles down there.
Professor Clarence shook his disapproving head.
So where are the others then? Well, they're making sure the hole doesn't cave in at the top,
said Weber.
More rock and dirt has fallen into it. They're erecting timber beams to keep the entrance clear. Very well then,
nodded Professor Clarence.
Let us gently try to remove the linen within this coffin. Oh, I feel weird,
muttered Weber.
Like my stomach is clenched in knots right now. I feel like we all do,
murmured Dr. Harby quickly. Weber glanced around the walls, watching the group of them huddle around the sarcophagus.
As incredible as this place is,
he said quietly.
This place gives me the heebie-jeebies.
He shared a quick glance with Dr. Harby, and Dr. Harby's dark eyes revealed an unsettling vibe.
What's wrong, Doctor?
He frowned. Dr. Harby shook his head slightly. His apprehension was plainly obvious. Every bone in his body wanted to immediately turn and run out of that chamber as fast as he could. Meanwhile, the professor and Brooks had eagerly started pulling away the old linen, crackling beneath the black resin, and as they removed the last piece of it, they all gasped, instinctively compelled to step away, their feet becoming anchored into the alabaster floor, and their faces engulfed within a blinding reflection of golden luster. As if the events of the night weren't already sufficient enough, the sight of a solid gold cloisonné coffin of Queen Nefertiti certainly was. It spilled out its blinding luminosity, cluttered with lines and lines of glyphs and symbols, representing the finest craftsmanship, something dare not even replicated at this present day.
Good Lord,
whispered Professor Clarence in disbelief, his eyes frozen within the illustrious golden hues.
even the gold is polished to a high sheen, so garish, as if it were done yesterday. How is this even possible? Many things here are beyond our understanding tonight, Professor,
Dr. Harby said quietly, wiping the tears away from the corners of his eyes. Commanding the deepest reverence imaginable, the sight of Queen Nefertiti's intact, gloriously golden coffin pierced their hearts, flooding each of their souls with an inexplicable wave of emotion that none of them had ever before experienced. The more they looked, the more unbearable it became, as if they weren't privy to such a sight. In a daze, the group of them simply stood around, as if they were swept up into gusts of wind from heaven, sucking all the sense of time and words away from them. Unable to look away, they melted into a state of adoring euphoria.
I can barely breathe.
Dr. Harby whispered emotionally, blotting his endless tears with his handkerchief.
There is an energy emanating from this coffin that I cannot explain. Indeed, I must agree with you,
answered Professor Clarence, sullenly dabbing his eyes.
No woman on earth has ever made me feel like this, except for this woman. Whoever she is laying here. This is the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. Oh, I'm with you,
added Bradford, his glancing eyes dancing within the radiance.
Women must have got watered down through the ages. All me missus does is bloody nagging me. And yet, I don't know who is in here. But I can't take my eyes away. But then I feel like I'm not supposed to be looking. It's bloody weird, all right. Professor!
Webber hissed with surprise.
The lanterns!
Everyone immediately glanced at the lanterns resting on the ledge of the sarcophagus, and to their own horror, they noticed them shaking, as if an unseen force was controlling them. Everyone's eyes widened with disbelief.
Electromagnetic interference with the metal of the lantern,
whispered Dr. Harby.
Has to be. I told you there is something else going on here. Oh, what do you mean, Doctor?
Answered Webber desperately, glancing across the sarcophagus at him.
Something else going on? This is a bad omen.
Dr. Harby warned quietly.
Something way beyond our understanding. Oh, Jesus, spare me,
mumbled Brooks, rolling his eyes.
Here we go again. A bad omen?
Bradford sneered sarcastically.
What do you mean? A curse? Oh, come on now, Doc. What do you take me for, eh? I am more than serious.
Dr. Harby retaliated, glaring at Bradford and then at Professor Clarence.
How can any of you be so facetious? It disgusts me. We do not know what these ancient humans were capable of. The entrance was blocked off for a reason, unmarked off the map for a reason. Don't you Englishmen see it? Or perhaps you don't want to see it?
Brooks glared at Dr. Harby with a face harder than stone.
Why, you bloody Egyptian bastard, you— Enough!
Professor Clarence interrupted, impatiently holding his hands up in protest.
Please! Now, Doctor, please, can you read these symbols?
Brooks clenched his jaw together, shaking his head with disdain, tightly gripping onto the edge of the sarcophagus. Wiping his eye with the palm of his hand, Dr. Harvey returned his focus to the coffin. He sighed softly, looking toward the head area, remaining composed as possible.
Above her head are 3 golden figures. People. Standing inside of the moon. It's symbolizing a celestial coronation scene, I believe. Below her chin are 2 jet eyes, the eyes of Ra, resting on a boat, symbolizing her soul's safe passageway to the afterlife. And beneath the boat is...
Suddenly, Dr. Harvey gasped, as if he had an epiphany. He stumbled back from the sarcophagus in shock.
Bismillah.
Professor Clarence quickly glanced at Dr. Harvey.
What, Doctor?
He anxiously pressed.
What do you see? What is under the boat?
Dr. Harvey's eyes were blinking with bewilderment.
It's the Erunasis Medallion.
He awkwardly whispered under his breath, lowering his head. The rest of them exchanged confused glances.
The what?
Professor Clarence stammered, utterly perplexed.
The what, Doctor? What is that? Come along, Doctor, do explain.
Secretly, Professor Clarence was becoming deeply concerned. His mind flashed back to the medallion he initially noticed on the anthropoid coffin lid.
The story of the Erunasis Medallion is shrouded in mystery. One of those typical myths you grow up knowing about, but one that would be almost impossible to believe. Or perhaps fairy tales, as you suggested, Brooks.
But what story, Harvey?
Professor Clarence interrupted anxiously.
Do tell us.
Dr. Harvey pursed his lips together and with a trembling breath pointed to the lower region of the golden lid.
If you choose not to listen, then it is your choice,
he began.
Again, these vertical glyphs are a warning of an impending death. Should entry into the chamber occur, like I have already advised you.
Impending death?
Weber cried.
What in God? This is bloody bollocks.
Bradford snapped through a griping jaw.
The whole fucking lot of it. I didn't come here for gold. I come here to do me damn job, not listen to this bloody sodded crap.
You have gone way too far with this hobby,
spat Brooks, flashing the doctor a lowly gaze.
I bet you had this planned all along, didn't you?
Professor Clarence gave Dr. Harvey a stern look.
Are you really trying to jeopardize my project?
Jeopardize your project?
Dr. Harvey sputtered, totally offended, finally feeling his own anger tipping over.
As Allah as my witness, my words are the truth. If it wasn't for me, you'd all still be digging up nuts and bolts on the Giza Plateau. Khalas, this is it. I offer nothing more to you imbeciles.
He snapped with a hushed whisper.
My work here is done. Your English glut is corrosive to the Egyptian culture. You have got what you wanted, so deal with it yourself. I am leaving at once.
And with that, Dr. Harvey threw his handkerchief onto the golden coffin and thumped out of the chamber. But as he began to walk away from the sarcophagus, the men's anger turned into cowers of fright.
Dr. Harvey!
Professor Clarence shrieked in distress. Dr. Harvey immediately turned and almost fainted. That lustrous golden coffin lid was hovering a foot above the sarcophagus in mid-air. He couldn't believe his eyes. He threw his hands to his mouth.
Ya Allah! Ya Allah!
He gasped, his breath stuck in his throat as he ran beside them.
What did you do? What did you do?
Nothing! Oh, nothing! It bloody well just lifted by itself.
Professor Clarence stammered.
I profusely apologize, Doctor.
He gaped at the lid hovering in the air.
I should have listened to you. My God! My God! No one's gonna believe us!
Weber gasped.
Oh, the lid is lifting up higher!
Bradford shrieked as they staggered back, watching it as it rose above their heads.
Fucking hell!
Like statues, not one of them could move.
Quickly!
Professor Clarence cried, clapping his hands together.
Let's look inside.
Moving closer, they had now witnessed the strangest part of all. The lifting of the lid revealed that the innermost coffin of Queen Nefertiti was empty. Empty! The only thing found in her place was a dull, very odd-looking medallion laying gently on top of some linen.
No!
Cried Dr. Harby, throwing his hand up to his heart, his eyes menaced with fright as he glanced at the professor.
The Erunasis Medallion! It cannot be! It cannot be! Jesus Christ! Where is Nefertiti?
Stuttered Professor Clarence, throwing his hands over his forehead.
The linen, the gesso, all intact, sealed, and yet her body is not inside, except this gold medallion. It must be a trap. Oh, are you hearing that?
Whispered Brooks, noticing a low humming sound emanating from inside the coffin. The five of them stared into the sarcophagus, glancing at the Erunasis Medallion.
I'm getting the hell out of here!
Weber explained, observing the medallion's iridescent, whitish-pink stone appearing to illuminate from the inside out.
Fair enough about the gem, whatever it is, but what is that language?
Murmured Professor Clarence, now glimpsing that cryptic script around the center stone, spiraling all the way out to the medallion's edge.
Nothing I can recognize even remotely.
Dr. Harby answered. Unable to resist, Professor Clarence picked up the medallion and noticed the backside mottled with patterns.
Oh, fractal geometry,
he whispered.
What on earth could it possibly mean?
It's a code,
Dr. Harby surmised.
For what?
Weber asked disbelievingly.
Something beyond our understanding, but we must leave it alone.
Professor Clarence held the medallion in his hand and observed how it was slung through a delicately thin, serpentine-woven necklace, finished with a magnetic clasp.
Professor, with all due respect,
Dr. Harby said,
we should leave at once and reseal this tomb.
Are you mad, Harby?
Brooks retorted.
After all this bloody effort, we've just witnessed something extraordinary. We should be documenting this.
This is no ordinary necklace.
Dr. Harby shook his head.
Indeed, at least as myth, and as far as I am concerned, it is clearly obvious that we are not welcome. You cannot even imagine the story behind this medallion.
Suddenly, Brooks collapsed into the dust of the alabaster floor.
Allah, it's happening!
Cried Dr. Harby. Everyone ran to Brooks' side, crouching down beside him.
Oh, Lord!
Weber cried, bending over him.
Oh, Jesus Christ, what did he touch? Call the others, Weber, now! Go now!
Professor Clarence pleaded desperately.
Nothing needs to be touched! Don't you understand?
Shouted Dr. Harby at the top of his lungs.
Jesus Christ, he's convulsing!
Bradford screamed, watching Brooks's eyes roll into the back of his head.
He's frothing!
As Bradford rolled Brooks on his side, Brooks bit his tongue and blood began to gush from his mouth uncontrollably.
Brooks!
He hollered, taking a piece of the ancient linen from the floor and shoved it into his bloodied mouth.
Come on, Brooks! Stay with me, lad!
He slapped him across the face.
Come on, fuck ya! Brooks! Brooks!
But the blood loss was too great. Bradford pinned his big brawny arms down onto Brooks's trembling shoulders. But incidentally, it was as if someone squeezed the very breath right out of Brooks's lungs, and his body went limp, becoming as still as the stagnant air surrounding them.
Get out of here now!
screamed Dr. Harvey.
All of you! We leave at once! We can't just leave poor Brooks in here!
Defended Professor Clarence, wiping the blood from his hands.
If we don't all get out now,
Dr. Harvey cried, thrusting his hands in the air,
we all share the same fate!
As everyone ran out of the chamber in tatters, Professor Clarence quickly snatched the Erunasis Medallion out of the golden coffin.
No!
Dr. Harvey shouted, slapping the professor's arm back down, glancing frightfully into his eyes.
You cannot take it!
Professor Clarence's face hardened.
I didn't spend £1,000 for nothing!
He spat into Dr. Harvey's face.
Even if death comes knocking at my door, this bloody medallion is coming back with me to Great Britain.
Pushing past Dr. Harvey, Professor Clarence ran out of the chamber, thrusting the Erunasis Medallion in his pocket. 6 months had passed since returning from the tumultuous Akhenaten expedition, and thankfully, Professor Clarence was back within the comforts of English life. Good ale and good hearty food. Yet, the events of the expedition continued to haunt him. He had learned that both Bradford and Webber had mysteriously died within a month of their return, and he could not shake off the cloud of guilt that hovered over him. Every night, he sat for hours upon hours on his Chesterfield lounge, smoking his pipe, contemplating what went wrong, what he wished he did differently on that fateful night. He became distant with all those closest to him. Seldom did he sleep in the comforts of his own home any more either, where his beloved wife and teenage children, Frank and Germanus, waited for him. Instead, he chose to sleep in the loft of his beloved study parlour on the East Docks of London. And, despite the turmoil he was beset with, not to mention an impending inquest into Brooks's death with Scotland Yard, the professor had already decided to return to Egypt, to pick up from where he left off, and to also amend his severed diplomatic ties with Dr. Harvey. Unfortunately, the professor had not spoken with Dr. Harvey since, and the letters he had sent remained unanswered. On one particular evening, sitting in front of his roasting Vitellius marble fireplace, Professor Clarence was flipping through his favorite sections of Homer's The Iliad, whilst enjoying a warm glass of port. But every so often, his mind would linger back to the dusty King's Valley, the quartzite sarcophagus, the walls beleaguered with glyphs, the enormous amounts of gold and precious plunder. He remembered the haunting words of Dr. Harvey.
This is a bad omen.
He shuddered. The words rattled him. Letting out an anxious sigh, Professor Clarence took another sip of port and glanced over his shoulder to the back of the study at several freshly nailed floorboards. Suddenly, without any warning, the professor's sight grew dim. It startled him, and he tried to stand to his feet.
Good God! What's happening to me?
He sat up, panicked, until a weight so great plummeted through his chest, and he fell to the floor, hitting the corner of the fireplace and receiving a nasty blow to the side of his head, knocking him out cold. An eerie silence now swept through that study parlour, engulfing the thousands of books, the shelves, the statues, the old frescoes on the walls, and especially those dark secrets burdening Professor Clarence's lifeless body.